Michael Blau, I'd be interested in your discussion of model session, the standard pattern of communication that Hubbard devised to provide predictability for the PC, auditor, and case supervisor, and to perform standard checks that ensure auditing sessions start with the PC ready to be audited. In my limited experience as an auditor, I found reads and floating needles difficult to recognize, and I found myself relying more on PC indicators, how the person looks. It was like the PC and the auditor would conspire to get through the session with credible worksheets and an after-session exam report. I found this both as an auditor and as the PC, but I can't speak for examiners. Now, in retrospect, I am ashamed to admit such a breach of integrity. Do you think such collusion was commonplace? Okay, Michael, some Scientology terminology there with some definitions in there, so I hope people who heard that question understand the basic gist of it. Model session is an issue that Hubbard put out that had a very exact, here's what you say, here's the sequence of actions that occur in every single or almost every single auditing session ever delivered in Scientology, right? Like you walk into the room, PC sits at the desk, the auditor sits at his side, the meter setup is done. There are a couple little things that always get done with the e-meter to set it up. You got the table set up and everything. You make sure the PC's comfortable in his chair. You ask him if he's comfortable. You ask him if he's hungry. You ask him if he's tired. If he is, then you can't do the session. You got to handle those things. Then you put him on the meter and you do little checks, like you have him take a deep breath, hold it for just a second and let it out through his mouth, and you look at the needle and it should fall, indicating, according to L. Ron Hubbard, that the body has enough energy in it to do a session. It's no such thing, but that's what Hubbard translated that to mean. And then you start the session, and you start it by saying, is there any reason not to begin the session? Good. This is the session. You always say it that way. This is the session. And then you do the process, right? First you do something called the rudiments, and then you do the main body of the session. And then when it looks like it's time to wrap up, you say, well, it looks like we're going to be ending session shortly. Is there anything you'd care to say or ask before I end the session? Write down whatever the guy says, and then you say, end of session. And you make sure he really gets it, right? And then the session's over, and you take the pre-clear to an examiner, a separate person with a meter, usually sitting in a room, and the PC goes in there, and he sits down and picks up the cans, and the examiner just looks at him, takes down anything he wants to say about the session he just had, and makes sure that the e-meter has a floating needle on it, okay? And that whole thing that I just described to you is the basic pattern of every single auditing session ever delivered in Scientology. The variation comes in as to what the processes consist of, the main body of the session, and how the PC responds to what is being done to him in the auditing session. Those are the variable factors. So, and there's hundreds and thousands of variables in those factors, okay? There's lots and lots of different kinds of auditing, lots of different processes that get run on people, and people from all different walks of life respond to auditing in different ways. They're supposed to respond in a uniform way, though, and that's what model session is all about, is making every session the same. And the theory of this, according to Hubbard, was that it would make it duplicatable so that people wouldn't be hung up on any variations or quirks of any individual auditors who might start a session, let's say, by saying, instead of this is the session, they say start of session, or, let's do a session, or okay, now the session started, right? You get these variable ways that you could accomplish the same thing, but Hubbard wanted it uniform, one to the next, because he said that made the session run itself out, so there wasn't any unnecessary attention or stress or trauma created by the session itself. That's the theory of the thing, okay? Okay, so that all being said, you asked, that during this, that there was sometimes an effort on your part as an auditor or PC, Mike, to fit what was happening into this model session and make it look like everything ran according to plan, even if it didn't. And that happens all the time. Because let's face it, Scientology, technology, the auditing that is done in Scientology, it's a sham. It's not doing what it says it's doing. It's doing something else. It is doing something, but it's not doing what it says it's doing, which means that everything that's happening in a Scientology auditing session is a misrepresentation of reality. You don't have a reactive mind. You don't have body thetans. These things that are addressed in auditing are addressing things that only have dim or somewhat, realistic connections with actual life and living and the actual reasons why we have problems and stress and trauma in the first place. So when you're addressing fantasies, made up reasons for things, then you can't help but be living in a little bit of a fantasy land there, right? There's some delusion going on. And so as a result of that, this nice little system that Hubbard set up, which should work like dominoes, bang, 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 and, it all works wonderfully. Well, it doesn't work that way. And so people sometimes have to fake it until they fake making it. That was really the deal. And so, Mike, you mentioned, being ashamed of the fact that you had to conspire in sometimes nonverbal way. Sometimes you and the PC just kind of look at each other and go, all right, cool. And you kind of glance at the meter and go, oh, yeah, no, your needle's floating. It's all good, right? Even though the needle's not really floating. And the guy doesn't really look that happy, but he wants to get through the session. He's got things to do. You want to get through the session. You don't want to be here for another 6 hours beating on this guy to try to make him conform in some way to Hubbard's processes and make the process work. See, that's really the thing, is you're trying to prove Scientology's working when it's actually not working. And you feel like, as a cult member, you have to make it work because this stuff is supposed to work all the time. So you got to make yourself make sense of it. And sometimes this leads to PCs and auditors openly or not so openly conspiring to make it look like the session went the way it was supposed to. Okay, and this happens all the time in Scientology. I heard about it. I did it on both ends, and I've watched other people and heard other people talk about it, which is why I talk about this with such certainty. So that's what I've seen, and I have seen examiners fake it on the floating needle thing too, right? That happens also. So I've seen at every stage of this, I've seen people, blow it or fake it or mess it, or like you mentioned, conspire. And I don't think it's that rare for that to happen. But here's the little sneaky thing. In case any of you guys are watching this and you're thinking, yeah, but wouldn't that show that it's all fake? And wouldn't the walls come tumbling down? And wouldn't they see? Guys, okay. They are doing all of that because they actually secretly think there's probably something wrong with them, not the system. And they're trying to be a good auditor or a good PC, good pre-clear, right? And they want to fit in. They want to mold themselves to become part of this system and get the gains that the system promises. And they don't see all of this as a fantasy. They don't see all of this as a bubble world. And so they don't think to question, what's going on around them as the problem. They look into themselves as the problem. They are the problem as far as they're concerned, both auditor and pre-clear in these circumstances. And that's why they feel justified or rationalize having to fit themselves, their round pegness, into a square hole of Scientology. And they feel like the square hole is the right thing and they should be square and they're not, but they got to fake it until they make it. So that's the mindset there as to why people would go through something like that. And, and if you think about it, that's not just in Scientology that people do that. It's trying to fit in, it's trying to conform, it's trying to be a good social member of this social reality that you find yourself in. And at the end of the day, that's really what it's all about. And that's what we all do. So there you go.